Le vamos a pedir al señor Aaron Wolf que cierre este panel.
Thank you. Like my host, I'm at a university also, and we call this, in a university, we call this the hour of death. So I wanted to reassure people, I'll be showing slides, the lights will go down, you can go ahead and take a nap, and nobody will know. So I'm going to take a yes. Yes, slow down. I want to start by pointing out that I'm in a college of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences. My original training is as a hydrogeologist, and I was trained in a very rational approach to both the water issue and to conflict resolution when I ended up getting involved in that. So we started out, when I developed a program in water conflict management, we started off by counting things. We started by, it's okay? Okay, so slower and louder. That's got it. We needed maps of the basins when we talk about shared waters. Nobody knew how many shared basins there were until we spent 3 years developing this map. There are 309 if you're interested. A number of those basins cause real headaches and at least headlines. Armies have been mobilized, shots have been fired, and also there's a tremendously rich history of collaboration and cooperation on precisely the same basins that people point to as sources of conflict. And again, we've been trying to compile as much data on these basins as possible to understand, be able to do the early warning that's necessary to put in place the dialogue and institutions that are necessary to prevent conflicts from. This is about half of my job is on the rational side of the map, developing this kind of thinking and this kind of early warning. But the other half is to me almost more important, and why it's important that I stress that I was trained as a scientist. Because all of the problems that we're talking about, and more importantly, all of the solutions are crafted generally by small groups of people in specific rooms. And so how we talk to each other, how we interact with each other, how we understand each other's worldviews becomes deeply critical to our approach to these sets of issues. So about half of my life is spent as a facilitator or a mediator on shared water basins, both large, international, and also small, small river basins around the world. About 8 years ago, Peter Glick and I co-hosted with the Pontifical Academy a meeting here where we asked precisely this sets of questions. We invited people at a very high level who had negotiated water treaties and spiritual leaders from a number of different faith traditions to come and talk to each other if we couldn't understand from people of faith, from people who facilitate and mediate from faith, whether there weren't tools and practices and techniques and worldviews that we as rational trained facilitators in the West might help enliven and enrich the conversation. So one of the critical things that happened when we brought these groups of people together was it was clear that our worldviews were very different, and yet there were international or transnational touchstones. This is a model, happens to be Kabbalistic, it doesn't matter, and I'll show you why in a second. That din on the left is the realm of justice, the closed, the laws, the rational world. And it's balanced by the world of chesed, of mercy, of the other, of community, of spirituality. And so when we have these conversations, these the spheres represent a pre-Enlightenment thinking in the West. In what we call in the West the Enlightenment, we separated those worlds of rationality and spirituality, and we said, well, in public discourse, we will only have public conversations about things that we can measure. You can have your spiritual life, but alone with your family on a Thursday, your Friday, your Saturday, or Sunday communities, and it doesn't come into public discourse. But in the room where we were, that idea of a separation, we have to remember, is a very recent, very geographic geographically specific event that took place. And in the room, when we're having these conversations around the world, these worlds are united, and they sit in balance here in what's called rachamim, in what's called compassion. The roots here in both Hebrew and Arabic are interesting. Rechem is a womb, and the idea is that a mother gives all of her chesed, all of her loving kindness to her unborn child, but only as long as she is healthy herself. So this idea of justice and mercy, being in balance and compassion, helps us understand how to have better conversations. Question is it international enough to be able to enhance our conversations regardless? And it turns out this same touchstone exists worldwide. In Arabic, there's 99 names of God: Al-Rahman, Al-Hakim, Al-Rahim. These are the three that represent. In Christianity, I don't need to tell this room, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. In other parts of the world, in a Taoist tradition, of course, we have the yin and the yang in perpetual balance with each other. In the Hindu tradition, Shiva's third eye sits in balance between the eye of the sun and the eye of the moon. All of my scientist friends at this point are getting very uncomfortable, so I'll give you a graph to look at. This is John Nash. The Nash equilibrium that we talk about in economics is precisely this understanding. What he discovered is that economics is not solely about individuals pursuing their self-interest, but there's an equilibrium between an individual's self-interest and the group's interest. And that's where we end up finding ourselves. We like the group, we care about the group, and we will do things for the group. So science finally caught up. He won the Nobel Prize in economics for discovering things that faith traditions had been preaching for 2,000 years. What does this have to do with water? Well, because I'm a water guy, of course I see the water molecule in this structure. It's not. But it also gives us a model for how to have a conversation. In the Arab world, there's something called a sulh, ceremony of forgiveness. And the idea is that when an injustice is done, we don't think about it like we do in the West, that it's just a crime against community, but it's a rent, a tearing of the fabric between the individual and the community. So there's a formal ceremony where the criminal comes to the community and asks for forgiveness. And there's this wonderful word that has Persian roots. Tahdin is the resolution of a conflict that involves no humiliation. So this is this idea of a balance between self and other, rationality and spirituality. And this idea exists certainly at the village level all over the world. And in a number of parts of the world, people are trying to reintroduce it, recognizing that this idea of community value is critical. Another touchstone that came up in this meeting is an idea of four worlds that exist within us, that exist within nature, and if you'd like, exist in the map of the consciousness of God. And so these are the four worlds in a Kabbalistic view. They come from the structure of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, which was a guided meditation from the outer world, the physical world, to the emotional world, to the intellectual world, to the spiritual world. This was reconstructed into the Jewish prayer service that Jews pray 3 times a day, this guided meditation between those four worlds. It exists in the structure at Angkor Wat, which was originally a Hindu structure with the same connotations. Now it's Buddhist. The idea of these four lenses through which we look at the world. In the Muslim world, Sharia is the physical law, Tariqa is the prayer of the heart, Hakika is the absolute truth, Marifa is attunement to the divine. This was explained to me this way. In Sharia, there's mine and there's yours. In Tariqa, what's mine is yours, what's yours is mine. In Hakika, there is no mine and there is no yours. But in Marifa, there is no me and there is no you. What does any of this have to do with water? We'll get there. The same structure we see Vishnu's 4 totems. Again, the physical strength represented by the mace, the glory of existence by the lotus flower, the mind chakra by the discus, and the conch, which resonates the Om, the primeval sound of all creation. And we find the same structure in indigenous traditions all over the world, certainly throughout Latin America. The shamanic tradition has this as the serpent, the panther, the hummingbird, and eagle. How do we use this in water? We've been talking about the rights to water as if all water was the same. And we've recognized in a number of comments that it's not. There's physical water on which we rely for our physical survival. You don't put a cost to that. You don't put a price to that. You don't use market mechanisms for that. And the same is true of spiritual water. But in between, the water that we rationalize, the water where we look for efficiencies, the water that's an input to businesses, these are the waters that we absolutely can. Just as Peter said, water is an economic good to some uses, and it's a human right for others. And so this structure helps us to understand the different waters and how we might approach each. As I say, for the environment, there's basic environment survival required. For transportation water, hydropower, all water is not the same. Recognizing and naming the spiritual value of water, I've found, elevates the conversation. Even amongst scientists, even amongst people who pride themselves on their atheism or their rationality, when a meeting is opened by a group, an array of people of faith, or in our part of the world, when the indigenous people will open with a prayer, it elevates the level of conversation. Water isn't just about numbers. It's not just about the things you can measure. It's also the things that we feel and are part of our very being. When we think about who to invite, these four worlds help us remind ourselves who needs to be invited. The physical, the practitioners, the policymakers, the emotional, the private enterprise that works on market mechanisms, the intellectual, academia, and always the spiritual community. Here, this is not an argument that has to be made, but I'm at a public land-grant university in a country that prides itself, or used to pride itself, on rationality. Sorry. It's a difficult conversation to have in large parts of the world, but once the door is open, I've found, again, it elevates the conversation. Professor Sultana mentioned, and Jerry mentioned, when you have people helping to translate the needs of the water community, it's better to have these guys do it than the person we normally send, which is this guy. Places of faith not only give us structures and concepts for dialogue, they also can act as mediators and facilitators. They can provide good offices. The Catholic Church has a stake in both sides of transboundary disputes all through Latin America. And the church has provided its good offices, and church members have been mediators and facilitators. Here, the Coptic Church played a role as mediator on the Nile. Turns out that the Buddha himself actually mediated a water conflict. He came to these people who were about to fight a war. He said, "What's the war about?" Went to the princes. They didn't know. Came all the way down to the peasants. They said, "Oh, it's about a shared river." Buddha went back to the princes. He said, is the blood of your people worth more than the water you're fighting about? And it stopped the war with one question. How do you incorporate this in our modern, rational world? The New Zealanders did this incredibly well. They came up with a freshwater management policy in 2014 where they tapped into the Maori traditions, again, these four worlds. And I'll just read the second paragraph without the Maori. All things in the natural world have Maori, have life force, a spiritual dimension, respect for the spiritual integrity of the environment, and God that created it will ensure that the treasure can be protected and passed on to succeeding generations. In the United States, the Massachusetts Episcopal Diocese reorganized their boundaries along watersheds for this rationale, simply demonstrating that we're all connected by water, rich and poor, urban and rural, upstream and downstream is a fine place to start. I think the Holy Spirit will take care of the rest. Thank you very much.